morning, viewers, and welcome to the Economy and Politics Show, where we discuss political economic issues as it concerns policies, investments, even politics, all how they impact the economy and our nation. Today is August 19, 2020. It's a midweek. Over here, we continue this conversation. Today, we'll look at, once again, the Company and Allied Matters Act 2020 bill, which was signed recently by President Muhammadu Buhari, and how it's going to improve our business environment as Nigeria continues to vie for that top position as a leading investment destination in Africa and across the globe. With me to lead this conversation is Mrs. Toyin Bashir, a partner with Banwo and Ighodalo, and also a head legal cluster with the Enabling Business Environment Secretariat that drives the processes of the Presidential Enabling Business Environment Council that is involved in improving Nigeria's business environment. PEBEC is chaired by Vice President Professor Yemi Osibanjo and Executive Secretary Dr. Jumoke Odowale, who is also the Senior Special Assistant to the President on Industries, Trade and Investment. So Mr. Toyin Bashir will be discussing how EBES and from the private sector angle has been working to ensure that CAMA bill comes good, even as it's signed to improve our business environment. Nice to have you on the show.
It's very nice to be here. Thank you so much.
All right, so for our business environment, stay tuned.
When we first met, the first question I asked was,
where have you been all my life?
Since then, we have taken every step together.
Especially when the kids were schooling abroad. Oh, how we made it through those years.
When we shared the same passion,
The same drive.
And the same vision to succeed. Let's help you achieve your visions and aspirations, milestone by milestone. FCMB, my bank and I.
Welcome back. So let's go on. The CAMA bill 2020 has been signed into law, and part of the Secretariat and group that has been working tirelessly for this is the Enabling Business Environment Secretariat, driving the processes of the Presidential Enabling Business Environment Council. And Mrs. Toyin Bashir is one of those wonderful private sector players who was involved in this from Banwo and Ighodalo Chambers Group. And she is here to tell us from her perspective, the legal angle of how this will improve our business environment. So let's first begin with how it will improve ease of doing business in Nigeria, Mrs. Toyin Bashir. This is part of the target of PEBEC to achieve the top 100 by 2020, where doing business is involved in the world.
Okay, thank you. Again, thank you for the opportunity to be here. In order to let me provide some context around this new act. So, from the onset, the federal government, of course, through the Presidential Enabling Business Environment Council, that is PEBEC, took intentional and deliberate steps to work with the leadership of the National Assembly to ensure that the CAMA bill, which is believed to be a very critical bill and it impacts a lot on the business climate, incorporates provisions which were progressive and which would have an effect on ease of doing business in Nigeria. So in order to progress that, the leadership of the National Assembly, that is the then Senate President, set up a technical advisory committee. I was a member of this committee. Essentially, it had about 5 broad objectives. But one of the critical ones was that it was important to create a framework that would essentially have a direct effect on the economy by ensuring that SMEs and MSMEs have a special legal framework. And then the second thing was one of the objectives was that it was important to have a framework that would support ease of setting up a business and also support the operations of these businesses post-registration. So now looking at the provisions itself, let me speak to the one which relates to starting a business, which is an indicator which you know that Nigeria is actually tracked on. So the first provision, and it's something that every Nigerian should know, is that a single person can set up a business. So you don't need partners anymore to be able to register your company. And this is particularly important because we're trying to, or rather the government is trying to stimulate entrepreneurship. So you have situations where people just want to set up their businesses by themselves and then look in the future for investors and then bring them on board. But they really don't want to go into any relationship or business relationship with anyone at the time. So now anybody can register their business all by themselves. Then the second thing, we're now going to process the documentation that you have to file at the CAC to ensure your business is registered. There was a document called the Declaration of Compliance. That document is required to be signed, by a lawyer, and is a statement on oath, which means that it has to be taken to the courts before a commissioner of oaths or before a notary public. And this essentially completes the process for completing the forms. But now a new document called the Statement of Compliance has been introduced through the CAMA 2020. The Statement of Compliance, the promoter or the owner of the business can simply complete that form and conclude his registration submission process. This means he doesn't have to have the additional cost of hiring a lawyer for that purpose. Simply, and also to take it to court or a notary public, simply filing it, simply completing it and filing it marks the end of that process. Then we also have the issue of common seal. This again is one of the processes that's tracked by the Doing Business team of the World Bank. It's no longer mandatory. Prior to the assent of the Companies and Allied Matters Act into law by Mr. President, it was a mandatory requirement. And of course, you know that there's some costs involved. A lot of people may not realize that every cost for an MSME is critical to the survival of his business. So as much as possible, we try to make it easy for especially small businesses. So that was the thinking behind it. And then we also have the introduction of something called the issued share capital. So previously, under the repealed Act, there was the concept of an authorized share capital. This has been abolished. Now we have issued share capital, which means that the persons wishing to set up business don't have to create capital that they don't require at a time. So they can simply just create what they want to allocate either to themselves, if they want to set up a single member company, or to other people as well, as opposed to creating shares and paying for such shares, which they don't require at the time. And then moving on to the special framework for SMEs, which is supposed to support ease of doing business. So one of the first things that was taken was a redefinition of the definition of a small company. So under the previous law, a small company was described as a company that has a turnover of 2 million naira and net assets of 1 million naira and below. This essentially means companies who had turnover of 2 million and above were not considered to be small companies, and so were then, subjected to rigorous provisions, which was also applicable to big corporates. Big companies. But now it's been reviewed. Small companies are now companies that generate turnover of 120 million. So 120 million and below, and net assets of 60 million and below, you'll be considered a small company. So you are now, under the new law, such small companies have been exempted from onerous obligations like having a company secretary, appointing an auditor, holding an AGM. Essentially, so I guess the idea is to also stress that encourage. So one of the thrusts behind finalizing that bill was a focus on making it easier to do business, particularly for small companies, which are the micro, small, and medium enterprises in Nigeria.
So, Mrs. Toyin Bashir, in essence, does this CAMA Act now help to strengthen Nigeria's quest to be a leading investor-friendly nation, a leading business-friendly environment for investors who want to do business in the country?
Absolutely. So, and I guess the interesting provisions which immediately come to my mind is the fact that the CAMA 2020 has created new legal vehicles. That's new types of companies. And one of them is a limited partnership. Now, a lot of investors have been clamoring for that kind of a legal structure. And I'll tell you why. Yeah, so you find that particularly maybe people in the private equity space. Yeah. So I know Lagos State has a limited partnership law, and that has been, but then it's only restricted to Lagos. But we want investors to go all over Nigeria, right? So the idea of a limited partnership, very attractive, because it enables them to, when they set up the limited partnership, there's the general partner who's responsible for day-to-day, which is the target company, if you like. And then there's the limited partner, which is the investor. So the PE company or the investment company just comes in, and his own liability is limited. He's a limited partner, he's a silent partner, he's just to provide the money. They go into a partnership agreement, they set the terms, then they realize the benefits, both realize the benefits, the company enjoys the influx of capital into the company, and then of course the investor gets his returns. So that is a very interesting development as a result of CAMA 2020. And I guess the second thing I'd like to talk about is probably the insolvency, the new insolvency structure that has been.
The insolvency structure, yeah.
Exactly. So so you are aware, that the existing structure under the repealed act was just winding up. Essentially, if you go into if business is going to financial distress, the only option was to wind it up, which means the business will die. But now, I've been working very closely with international and local experts on business rescue. We now have interesting provisions which are targeted at resuscitating businesses that don't necessarily have to die. So there are provisions for company voluntary arrangements. There are provisions also which enables such business to be rescued essentially and sustained. And of course the advantages are there. One, there's investor confidence. You know that if indeed, you can project to get returns, but things happen. Look at COVID-19. But if it does go into distress, then at least there are certain steps you can do to try to resuscitate to ensure that the business doesn't die. And then the returns don't go away. There's even the ripple effect on the employment. Businesses will die, which means people lose their jobs. But then if they're resuscitated again, it supports employment. Even looking at vendors, some businesses survive simply by providing services to a big corporate, and then with the end of that company, which means some smaller businesses probably gets, caught up in that. So this is absolutely laudable. I know that investors will be very happy. As a commercial lawyer myself, I know that it is something that they inquire about a lot. What's your insolvency regime? Essentially because they want to know, is there a way that even if, I will try to mitigate my risks, but if it does happen, can we still take steps to ensure that my returns are not completely gone?
Yes, I hear you very well in terms of that insolvency.
Because it's very important, particularly when you look at the unemployment rate currently still high. We need to find ways to ensure that businesses survive or are sustainable, and the sectors that are drivers of the economy, we find a way to manage the whole process, particularly even at the receivership and provisions, which is very important. And that's one thing we take note of. One very critical institution in driving this process, even improving our business environment, is the Corporate Affairs Commission. And your colleagues in the legal space have raised several weeks ago some concerns about the processes in terms of quickly getting information on companies, easing the process of incorporation, amongst others. Now, the CAC now has the opportunity to strengthen its operations and even, like experts would say, digitize this process and expand its reach across the country, empower its staff, human capacity development. What is the EBES doing in this regard to partner more with CAC and ensure that they're able to deliver in terms of the reforms? Because this act is good, but the institutions that are driving it are very, very important in ensuring that this is carried out.
The idea is, absolutely, you've gotten it absolutely right. That first of all, CAMA 2020 sort of like sets the tone. I must say that the current Registrar General of the Corporate Affairs Commission, as Abubakar, is someone who seems to be very committed to actually digitizing the commission. Right now, we can see it's semi-digitized, so it's about taking us to the promised land, to completion essentially. And I think COVID-19 kind of like expedited that process. So probably very soon. And then of course, CAMA 2020 now came and just basically provided the legal framework. So processes now where we support electronic submissions. So looking at COVID-19, you know that quite a number of businesses had statutory obligations in terms of filings. They couldn't do that because a lot of those processes are manual. But now there are provisions in CAMA which supports electronic filings, electronic
for private companies,
except for private companies, even public companies. You can actually submit it. And then records now can be stored electronically. So where you have all these big registers that we used to have, or registers in terms of minutes books, or register of members, or register of charges, now CAMA has allowed companies to store it in electronic format. So it can also be sent to the regulator as at when due. This, in a sense, has set the tone for easier way of doing things, even efficiency. Because when you look at it, if this process had been deployed earlier, looking at the situation that most businesses faced during COVID-19, there wouldn't have been an issue. Essentially, you just have continued to do, even the fact that, and I know that you're aware, that in a bid to control the spread of COVID-19, the federal government issued a directive for staff to remain at home. This generally has affected most of the government agencies. So efficiency levels have dropped because manpower has dropped. But then in cases where government agencies, including the CAC, if they had deployed technology solutions at the time, those staff could possibly have been working at home, because we know quite a number of people in the private sector who are working and they're very efficient and they're still working and they're working at home. So on the side of, I know that the federal government, of course, through PEMBEC and ultimately through EBES being the implementing arm of PEMBEC, will continue to support on a technical basis, agencies like the Corporate Affairs Commission to just ensure that their processes are further streamlined, they are more efficient, just so that it can deliver the promise of ease of doing business to Nigerians.
It's very important. Apart from even the CAC, other critical
government institutions, there needs to be that collaboration. They need to be singing the same tune to ensure that this whole landmark change in over 30 years becomes a transformation totally for our business environment. I'm particularly thrilled that the electronic processes now, private companies, they can even carry out their meetings, annual general meetings, electronically and without any hindrance. that again brings...
That's a very good point that you made. That in itself, to think that that provision was there before COVID-19 happened. And the benefits of that is actually twofold. One, there's the convenience. So you have international investors who are located all around the world, even local investors. You have investments in Lagos, you're in Enugu or somewhere. And then you now have to physically come and attend meetings. The cost, the time, but now you can just plug in, and the non-resident directors who live abroad can actually join those meetings and participate at no cost. So and then there's some corporate governance sort of like a corporate governance policy statement that it's good for directors to have meetings quarterly. And this could be onerous especially for directors who have multiple positions in some companies, and of course the ones living outside Nigeria. But now, you can do that. You can actually have, because it's international best practice that such meetings hold, on a quarterly basis. They can actually work towards that, and that in itself will strengthen, their corporate governance framework.
That's well noted.
Now let's look at the aspect of some concerns around corporate governance. I know that this act is far-reaching and even down to religious organizations, trusteeships, and compositions. But some corporate governance experts have raised concerns also around the CAMA Bill 2020, that's the CAMA Act now 2020. From your interactions with your colleagues in the legal space, what are one or two of those major issues that could come for consideration in terms of forward reforms and review where necessary?
I'll speak myself. In my own opinion, it's a welcome development. And I say this because it's important that we recognize that there should be structures to guide even non-profit organizations. I mean, so you have institutions or associations or bodies that are set up, and they are run through charitable donations, gifts, contributions. There should be some element of structure in place, just to ensure that such monies are used judiciously and for the objectives that the organizations were even set up for. And so it lists out a process. The provisions list out a process where there's a reasonable expectation. It's not just and when you deal with regulators, it's not just that somebody said something and then it happened. There will be documentation. There will be an allegation. There will probably be so much, in terms of information, whether it's documentary or otherwise, documentary evidence to show that some elements of, so there's reference to fraud or misconduct, and so they look into it. And where it's established, they don't say that it will stop, but that they put interim managers in place. And then there's also applications to court, where documents will be presented to court. And then, essentially what this is trying to do is sort of like be an incentive, if you like, for non-profit organizations to do things in a more structured and a better way. And then to ensure that when these monies are given, and then when you look at it, you find that, in practical terms, when you look at that space, you find that a lot of international donors are very, wary, of giving monies to organizations that are actually run by Nigerians. So, and that's because their own concern is that the money is actually used for the objective. They don't want situations whereby people then start paying themselves huge salaries and using it for all sorts of things. When you register an organization like that, when you formalize it, there are certain objectives that you're saying that this money is going to be used for. So you have to be accountable. If you're not using it for that purpose, and if the people who are giving you that money cannot come, because if you give money and you go, you may not even follow up. So somebody just has to.
So in essence, this would entrench transparency and governance,
exactly.
Which foreign investors have always been talking about, critical for doing business in Nigeria.
Absolutely. So there's absolutely no reason why non-profits also shouldn't be accountable to the people who provided the money, because in the process of doing this, certain things will be revealed. So I think it's an incentive for people to do things properly, knowing that there's some oversight, to some extent, and that if indeed your court haven't done, if it's established that you have undertaken fraud or you have misused the funds which were set up for specific objectives, then I think you should actually face the law.
Okay, so transparency and governance, very critical as we continue to see how the
CAMA Act implementation will transform Nigeria's business environment. We will go on a breather, and when we return, we will continue on this conversation. Stay tuned.
When we first met, the first question I asked was,
where have you been all my life?
Since then, we have taken every step together.
Especially when the kids were schooling abroad. Oh, how we made it through those years.
When we shared the same passion,
The same drive.
and the same vision to succeed. Let's help you achieve your visions and aspirations, milestone by milestone. FCMB, my bank and I.
Welcome back, and I really like the fact that we are seeing great prospect of transparency and governance. The drive is going to be very deep, and we're going to see transformation in the business environment in Nigeria. In acts like this, we know that there will always be reservations, but it's very important that the legal framework or the interpretations are clear and engagements continue in this regard, which is very important. Now, let's go to states, because states are very key in driving the ease of doing business. And for you, Mrs. Toyin Bashir, I know you've been in the technical team, you've worked across states through the initiative of PEBEC in terms of supporting in how they can improve the ease of doing business. How will this act also help the states as they seek to attract investments and they want to improve the business environment?
Okay, thank you. So you're right. Yes, PEVEC through EBES have been supporting states because the mandate actually goes beyond on the federal. I mean, the interventions initially started with Lagos and Kano states, but the ease of doing business is one economy, right? It cuts across all the states. So there was actually an intentional plan to go to each of those states and see how one can support ease of doing business. So for me, in relation to the CAMA, I think it's just what we have been pushing for with most state governments, that it's important to have a framework in place to actually work on ease of doing business. So we find out that some states have essentially set up a similar structure than like what is in on the federal level, where there's a PEVEC and an EBES. So the state government is there, and they also have a secretariat, because these things can't just happen. You have to do it in a systemic manner, and you have to be deliberate about it. So what it would be that for the states who have set up those structures, it's then the burden or the responsibility, if you like, is now with each of those people who are tasked with ensuring that the information, all the benefits, some of which we've discussed today, are actually transmitted to the people in the states, because they are closer to the states. So if they don't know, so if a small company doesn't know that he has been exempted from, appointing a company secretary, he probably will still continue doing it. He won't be able to enjoy all those exemptions. He will do that. He will appoint his auditor. He will continue having his, the AGM. And same thing, some businesses won't be run properly. Like you mentioned, there are provisions on transparency. And if all those provisions on transparency, there are ones that protect minority shareholders. So, there's some provisions which say if you want to buy up or take over a company by buying 50% of the shares, you have to buy the rest, which protects the ones that are not majority shareholders, so there's so many benefits. Even the corporate governance we've been talking about, there are provisions there which separates, the office of the chairman and the CEO now, there are provisions which actually limits the amount of companies some directors can be, in terms of the amount of boards some directors can be on. Is limited to 5 now for public companies, and there are just so many, that, and disclosures as well. If all these great, innovations and all these lovely provisions that have been introduced by the Act doesn't trickle down to the people, then they wouldn't feel the effect. And so in order to do that, I guess it would be to encourage state governments to be very deliberate about ensuring that certain people are tasked within the state, whether they're creating the structure that has been adopted by PEVEC, or they're just creating something that will ensure that this is done. But the critical thing is about advocacy and just ensuring that information goes. Because once the information goes and they're able to enjoy it, we can then witness the transformation across the country.
Yes, I agree with you. The information
is very important, particularly this unique area of the definition of small companies. I mean, it's something that needs to trickle down across the country for companies to know that this is the categorization now under the Act, to ensure that they can continue to go through processes and reduce the gridlocks or bottlenecks that have been over the years before this new Act was signed into law. I mean, I've heard you very well about the fact that it also brings this share capital provision, limited partnership, which is something like a lot of private equity and venture capital, like you said, have been interested in clarity. So hopefully we should see huge investments coming, and that clarity is there. But in terms of, you've worked in this process, you've been involved in the technical committee, and it's nice to see what you've worked on, partnered with, given time and resource to finally materialize into an act. What are your thoughts, your closing thoughts around this act, and the opportunities and seeming challenges you may see ahead that can be reviewed in course of time?
So for me, it was a great moment to witness. I mean, so on so many levels. You first start with the fact that there were quite a number of governments. You're just seeing the executive working together with the legislative arm towards a common goal. That was lovely to see. It was, I mean, it just essentially shows that collaboration will take us very far. And then, of course, there are people like me from the private sector who play in this space. So we have a stake. So there's absolutely no reason. And I mean, this is something that my firm, Banwo Ighodalo, is very passionate about. I mean, so we can mourn about all of these issues. CAMA is a 30-year law. It's been there.
Yeah.
I mean, the time has since shifted in terms of the world. And then here's Nigeria, a big player, still having a business law that is 30 years old. You know, so all of that, all the work and everything that went into that, and of course, this was a collaborative thing. It was the National Assembly, of course, the National Assembly, the executive, through the PEPED, then there were private organizations, even the Nigerian Economic Summit Group. There was also partnering with the lawyers through the section of business law. We have the chairman of those sections, Mr. Shini Adiu, SAN, and Mr. Olumide Akpata, who is now the, NBA president-elect, all the resources and just that collaboration. We're seeing arms of government, we're seeing different parts of the, the private sector all coming together to just ensure that we have a document that will promote commercial activities, that will be more in tandem, that will make Nigeria more competitive in that space. And so for me, it's just now about implementation. We're looking forward to how these provisions will become live and then how it will impact on the economy. And then I guess we'll also end with saying that a law is what it is at the time. Even as we go along, we'll probably still face some gaps and some challenges. It may not be perfect, but it sure is a better place than where we were before. And we can always take care of any gaps that we see in the future, but we have started on the right path. And I believe that the only way up is up from here. Yes.
Anyway, it's up for Nigeria from here, and hopefully the implementation will be done accordingly, and all considerations will be taken to ensure that we move our country to become a leading
destination for investment and for doing business globally. Thank you very much, Mrs. Toyin Bashir, partner Banwo Ighodalo, Legal Chambers, and also head Legal Cluster Enabling Business Environment Secretariat, the drivers of the Presidential Enabling Business Environment Council processes for putting Nigeria on the pedestal of being a leading business environment for investors. It was wonderful discussing the Company and Allied Matters Act 2020, which has been signed into law, and we hope that implementation would take effect quickly and this will transform our business environment for good. Thank you once again, and hope to have you in subsequent editions to discuss the progress made on this act.
It was my pleasure, really. My pleasure. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Yes. Thank you. And that will be all for this edition of the Economy and Politics Show. You can send your comments and views to news@proshareng.com, and also join our website, www.proshareng.com, to watch our videos with our news stories and reports. Join us by 10 a.m. as we continue the conversation on the financial and capital market as it relates to the economy on our market review. Till we come your way again, thank you for watching. Have a nice day and stay safe.